In the historic town called Leuchars, there is, like in many towns across the country, a church, or kirk. The church in Leuchars is very historic. It is nearly 1,000 years old and showcases some of the only examples of Norman church design in Scotland. This is the name of the church in Leuchars. Like most churches, it is dedicated to a saint. Normally you'd look over its name with mild interest, but this name stood out to me and caught my attention. I'd never heard of this saint, and indeed it seems like basically no one has. In fact, no mention of him can be found anywhere else in Scotland or indeed the world. No other church is dedicated to him. No historical records contain his name. Aside from this one church in Leuchars, he simply doesn't exist. I'm drawn to forgotten stories, lost locations and obscure figures, and perhaps this saint is the epitome of the obscure figure, someone who's only ever mentioned once in the historical record. Yet clearly he had quite significant importance for as fine and important a church as Leuchars to be named after him. So I began to dig into his story, and have discovered a most interesting pattern. Ancient saints that the church in general, and indeed society, have forgotten completely, and are only remembered through place names, or indeed, in some of these cases, have practically no historical record whatsoever. How can these important men, so important for churches and indeed entire towns to be named after them, simply disappear? This is the story of the saints the church forgot. We'll return to Leuchars later. First, let's start with one of the other saints that have been practically lost to history, Saint Fillan. Saint Fillan, like many saints and monks in early medieval Scotland, was born in Ireland. His name, which means little wolf in Gaelic, gives the game away. He was of noble blood, and in 717 he travelled to Scotland with his mother, who is sometimes called a saint too. There he lived life as a hermit and spent most of his time in Perthshire. Occasionally he ventured down into Fife, where a church is named after him. It is said that he helped the locals in many ways, frequently sat on a stone called Fillan's Stone, which was near a water spring and well. After his death he was held in high regard by the locals and indeed by the church. He has an official feast day, and a priory was built in Perthshire, and the area in which he was active was named Strathfillan in his honour, as was a small village called Kilfillan, or Fillan's monastic cell. According to legend, the famous Robert de Bruce won his decisive victory over the English at Bannockburn after bringing the saint's arm bone to the battlefield. Well, you might be saying, this hardly sounds like a forgotten saint. Indeed, Saint Fillan is one of Scotland's most well-known saints. Except there's a problem. Hidden behind the considerable fame of this Saint Fillan, there can be found the story of a different, earlier Saint Fillan, a man whose legacy has faded and nearly disappeared behind the fame of this later Fillan. This is the man we'll be looking at. This earlier Saint Fillan was active in the 6th century, so roughly 200 years prior to the time of the later Fillan. This makes him one of the earliest Scottish saints. Likewise, based on his name, we can assume he's Irish. He seems to have been active in Fife, especially the southern coast. In the village of Pittenweem there is a small cave called St. Fillan's Cave, the site of a small chapel. The cave was lost during the Middle Ages, but rediscovered when a farmer's horse fell through the entrance in the 1930s. He likely lived as a hermit and died in his hermitage. The legends go that he frequently sat upon a stone called Fillan's Stone, which is near a spring of water. Unlike the later Fillan, not much is known about his life. Indeed, like the later Fillan, the saint was practically forgotten until the 19th century, with the work of scholars William Skene and James McKinley. Here's where the mystery begins. You see, McKinley notes in his work that Dr. Skene was of the opinion that many of the locations we now attribute to the later Fillan, so the sites in Perthshire such as Kilfillan and the village of St. Fillan's, were named after this earlier Fillan, not the more famous one. In other words, they view this earlier saint as being more influential than the later saint. However, other writers, such as Michael Barrett, make the opposite conclusion, that it was the 8th century Fillan who was the main one, and that even sites in southern Fife were named after him, and not Fillan of Pittenweem. I think it's fair to say that there is a great deal of confusion about the exact identities of both these saints. Indeed, I think it is very possible that one of them simply didn't exist, and that the two Fillans were one person. In defense of this view, I can point out the similarities between them. Firstly, they both have the exact same name, and both came from Ireland. The later Fillan has a more documented life, whilst the earlier Fillan seems to have only been majorly discovered in the 19th century. It seems strange that there would be two Irish saints present in roughly the same area, and that one of them became famous and the other was forgotten. Perhaps it is more likely that Fillan of Pittenweem was created by historical error. The evidence in support of this is that their stories are strikingly similar. Both seem to have come from Ireland, and at least the later Fillan is said to have been active in Fife, where he could have gained a following and so inspired the place names. Both saints were associated with their own stones, upon which they supposedly sat, and which are located near springs of water. And the presence of a 6th century Irish saint in Fife is quite rare. The arguments against this view are likewise strong, however. Both saints have their own feast days, which are in separate months. The later Fillan is known as the patron saint of the mentally ill, whilst the earlier Fillan is said to have healed different conditions entirely. Likewise, they were said to be 200 years apart, which is not a minor error. In the end, I think the most likely conclusion is that they were different people. However, neither I nor the scholars can determine exactly which places were named in honour of the famous Fillan or the shadowy Fillan. Now, when it comes to the identity of the mysterious saint of the Luchers Church, there are two options. Either the rendering is correct, in which case the story ends, because that's a dead end. The other option is that the name is an English version of the ancient name Ethernan. If correct, this church was likely named after Saint Ethernan. But who was this Ethernan? Well, he's very shadowy too. The only thing we know is that in 669, the Chronicles of Ulster record that he was killed by the Picts. His inclusion in the Ulster Chronicles suggests that, like Fillan, he was of Irish origin. However, some scholars, such as Tom Clancy, point out that the name Ethernan was rare in Ireland, and it's possible he was Pictish. He seems to have been active in southern Fife and was buried on the Isle of May, a small island south of Fife. In the centuries following his death, his grave seems to have become a pilgrimage site, which became famous in medieval times. This is where the story should end, except there's a problem. The priory on the Isle of May was not dedicated to St. Ethernan, but rather to someone else, St. Adrian of May. This St. Adrian appears in the historical records in the 9th century, 200 years after Ethernan. He could well have been Irish, like Ethernan, and potentially became Bishop of St. Andrews. However, he was apparently killed by raiding Danes in 875. It was in honour of this saint, Adrian, that the subsequent priory was named, and it was his relics that later Scottish kings sought out. In other words, his fame eclipsed that of his earlier counterpart. However, this is where it gets confusing. Some scholars, such as David Keyes, believe that Ethernan and Adrian are the same person. He argues that Adrian was just an English version of Ethernan, and seems not to credit the earlier saint whatsoever. However, in his 1998 book, Peter Yeoman argues the opposite, that the later St. Adrian is a medieval creation, and that his life and death at the hands of the Danes was a misremembering of the earlier, true story of Ethernan, who was killed by the Picts. He argues that during the 9th and 10th centuries, many ancient stories were renovated to match contemporary events, and that many saints who had been killed by the now vanished Picts were instead said to have been killed by raiders. However, I'm not entirely convinced by either argument. The existence of the 7th century Ethernan seems certain. whilst the later Adrian of May was one of Scotland's most famous and respected saints. Multiple kings made visit to the island to visit his relics, and Danish raids on coastal priories were very common. In the end, I think they were two separate people, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments.